Yeah.
The War of 1812. The War of 1812 was a war that was heavily overshadowed by the Napoleonic Wars that occurred in Europe during the first decade of the 1800s. After the end of the American Revolutionary War in 1783, many Americans still upheld an ill attitude towards its former mother country. On June 18, 1812, U.S. President James Madison declared war on Great Britain.
War!
The U.S. Congress, however, was reluctant to spend the funds to equip the army with supplies. The British provinces weren't any more convincing. They lacked troops, food, and supplies to even sustain a war, having gathered only 5,200 men compared to the 7,000 Americans.
Nonetheless, the War of 1812 began with the siege of Fort Mackinac and ended with the Battle of New Orleans, which was fought 2 weeks after the war was declared over. The war ended on February 18, 1815, with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium. The results of the war included a total of 15,000 general American casualties, 10,000 British casualties, and 10,000 native casualties, including citizens.
The war also yielded great Canadian figures, such as Major General Sir Isaac Brock, who was responsible for defending Upper Canada, and Tecumseh, a Native American Shawnee chief who was the leader of a multi-tribal confederacy. Both Brock and Tecumseh died during the war. The war itself could have been avoided, although it bore great significance to our country's history, the first being a confederacy that, if formally established, would have shaped Canada much differently than we know to this day. It started with one man, Tecumseh. Driven to establish tribal unity in the U.S., his ambition was sparked by the amount of land being lost to the Americans. A confederacy was in the making, with several thousands of warriors from all over North America, conceived by the appeal of Tecumseh's brother, the Prophet. Its prospect was to establish its own large indigenous territory. Unfortunately, the death of Tecumseh had a crippling effect on his Aboriginal allies, and the idea of a confederacy soon dissolved later. Had this Indigenous confederacy grown larger, relations with Indigenous people in Canada might have been very different. Imagine if there was a separate Indigenous country in North America. It would have changed our geography and subsequently our world views. Something so impactful was so close to becoming reality, but it did not, and instead paved a different path for Indigenous life in North America.
Another significance of the war was that it formed better relations between Canada and the United States. Before the war, both countries had mixed, often negative views of the other, which dampened their relationship. The signing of the Treaty of Ghent called for a truce, and both Britain and the US were willing to settle their differences in peaceful resolutions. The war had established each country as an equal, and neither country found a reason to ever fight again. They settled the major boundary dispute by forming the 49th parallel. The peace between Canada and the United States has been kept ever since, and relations may have been different without the war.
Finally, the War of 1812 is significant to Canada because it is what shaped us as a unified whole, into Canadians. Before 1815, Canada, or British North America, was composed of generations of settlers and Americans that had fled the Revolution or were hoping to easily buy land. These people had no strong connection to the British Empire. When the war broke out, Britain was busy fighting its own war in Europe and had little to give to Canada for support. Instead, the war was fought by a few British regulars, Canadian militia, and Native Americans. We owe it to those individuals who chose to fight for their home, laying the foundation for our Canada.